Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Ask Us Anything Analytics. Today I have with me Matthew Brandt, who is Matty Two Shoes on Twitch and YouTube. Matthew is an analyst, decision scientist, and I'm happy to have him on the show today. How's it going today, Matthew?
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. Really, I'm in a good mood. I mean, it's Friday evening here in Zurich, Switzerland, so all
That's
good.
awesome. And yes, thank you so much for joining us late on a Friday night, your time. Nice, relaxing Friday afternoon here on the East Coast in the United States. I'm excited to kind of dive in and find out more about your background, what you've been up to, and all of that good stuff. So let's just kick it off. Generally, can you just let us know about your background and what you've been up to?
Absolutely. So I actually didn't start in analytics. A lot of people I know have not started in analytics, so it's a pretty common thing to hear about. I studied hospitality here in Switzerland. It's a pretty well-renowned university for that. But I have always been really passionate about tech. And after university, the hospitality industry, there wasn't a lot of tech for me to do there. They were still a little bit far behind. And so I started in recruitment. I started doing kind of everything for a small recruitment company. It meant printing business cards, doing the website, all that stuff. And that's where I first started to encounter these kind of KPIs, these mysterious metrics that CEO and COO were talking about all the time about like, yeah, they have to send this many CVs per position, or they need to make this many phone calls per week. And I started to think about data there, and I got really passionate about it and figured out that it's a great way to influence the business. And so I spent the next 10 to 12 years working my way through different data positions, starting with web analytics, where eventually I learned that there's more data than just what you measure on your website, which is really exciting. And now I would say I have a pretty broad role. I call myself a decision engineer because I effectively just use data to help people make better decisions. And it doesn't matter where that data comes from, the process is really important. And I try to emphasize that in all of my stakeholder interactions.
That's really cool. So a common theme running here between all of the guests I've had so far in the show, or I would say most of them, I can't remember all for sure, and myself, is that we're all kind of self-taught. We all had some business use case where either a manager or someone else had some KPIs that we needed to run with, and kind of the rest is history. That's pretty cool. Um, I wonder, in your experience, do you think that being self-taught is more common, or do you think it's more common nowadays for people to like either get a degree or take courses and stuff like that? What have you seen out there?
It's a really interesting question. I'm really passionate about education, and that's why you're not really taking away time from me on a Friday evening. I'm actually going to be live streaming on Twitch in about 2 hours from now, anyway. And that's part of like this whole thing that I've identified, which is that the education in the data space is really lagging behind. In other industries, I don't think that's as remarkable because those industries move at a different pace. But what we're seeing in the data space, and we've been seeing this for a long time, is that people coming out of university or out of formal education programs are lagging behind in terms of practical knowledge. The theoretical knowledge hasn't really changed, but the fact that tools move at such a large pace, the fact that circumstances change. I mean, privacy alone changes every 6 to 8 months. Some major regulation comes into force. It's just very hard for people to stay on top of that. And of course, the way that the formal education system works, I also teach at a university here in Zurich.
Oh, cool.
Materials need to be verified, right? So it takes time for that material to trickle down into these programs. So that's why I've been really invested in kind of self learning, and also by doing that I also teach others inadvertently, whether that's a good thing or not. And we learn together, and I think that's really something that in the data industry is particularly necessary because those programs don't have a chance to catch up.
I think that's totally true. I recently had the opportunity to meet with and speak with a bunch of students from Boston University, and they have I'm not sure if it's a data engineering or data science program there, but it's definitely a data focused program. And they're not using DBT yet, and no knock against them, but it's like DBT is new enough that it hadn't had the opportunity to trickle into the program yet. And right now, it's such a standard and kind of de facto way of doing things that I imagine that they will be adding that to the curriculum soon, especially after seeing, they spoke with me and saw my passion for the tool and how necessary I think it is these days. Speaking of which, do you use DBT at all?
We do not actually.
Okay, yeah.
Um, I know that you wanted to get around to the tech stack, so maybe we should talk about that.
Yeah, why don't we just go into like what's your favorite tools and what kind of stack are you using?
Yeah, so my favorite tool, as I always say, is the best tool for the job. Much like I really like to sort of do handiwork around the house and stuff like that. And I'm not the person to be like, oh, I need to use a screwdriver for everything, or I need to use an electric screwdriver for everything, or something like that. And in the data world, I kind of have the same approach. I try not to come in with too much bias, but of course, we do have our preferences now. And one of my big preferences as of late is on the top layer, which is basically what stakeholders use, what we use to interact with stakeholders, what we deliver reports in, what we deliver all kinds of data in, is we're using a tool called Count. So Count is a canvas. It's a little bit like Miro and Tableau having a kid together. Um, where you can do SQL and Python, but you can visualize at the same time, and it's an open layout, and that's been really great for us. We're a relatively small company, around 35 people, and that's a great thing because it sits right on top of your warehouse. And what we use it for is both for kind of static reports and things like that, but also these really intense collaborations with UX and product to discover paths and look at flows, and just the power of being able to have the actual flow in there with screenshots, but also have the data and the filtering options. That's something that is unbeatable for me right now.
That's really cool. So I was actually exposed to Count just earlier this week. I'd never heard of it, and I was on a call with a prospective client, and he was showing me kind of what's in his database and stuff. And instead of going to the database directly, he just opens up Count, and you have your database explorer there, but you could drag and drop, you could build charts right there, but it's also an empty, infinite canvas like some graphic design tools are. So it's
Exactly.
very interesting kind of space. I've never seen a BI tool like that before. Definitely interesting value proposition there. What about for like your data storage, Snowflake, BigQuery? What type of database are you into?
So we're currently on BigQuery. Our entire application infrastructure runs in Google Cloud infrastructure.
Oh,
So
cool.
it just made sense to have BigQuery there. We use at the moment we use native CDC to get some stuff from our backend database, which is a Postgres database, but we're probably going to be looking into getting a third-party tool to help that because Google's native CDC isn't very good. Let's put it that way. It's sort of like you point it at a database and then it says, "Okay, I'll try my best," you know. Um, and in terms of source, so we primarily use behavioral data as we are an app. We are a mobile app, and that's 95% of the business is through the app.
Can
So
you explain just the use of the app real quick so I can kind of
oh
visualize what the
yeah,
data might be like?
yeah. So we are a one-stop shop for healthcare for Switzerland. Switzerland has a very unique healthcare system in that it's state mandated and to some point also state controlled, but with private companies. And so there's a universal system that everyone adheres to, and there's some regulations around that, and then there's like a lot of optional stuff. And we basically have an app that allows you to do a lot of things within the healthcare ecosystem, things like checking your symptoms, things like booking appointments, things that as an individual, if you didn't have the app, you'd have to go to multiple different places to do, depending on what type of treatment you need. I mean, it's a very classic situation. And in a lot of countries, this is very fragmented, but we have a very unique
Yes.
situation in that everything is running through some kind of centralized system. Yeah.
That is pretty cool.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
So
in
when it
the
comes
US,
to,
you
yeah.
cannot book an appointment online.
Yeah, I mean here it really depends. Like you have like somewhere between 60 to 80 different patient information systems here. So if your information is in one of those systems and you happen to go to a doctor that has that system, you might be able to book an appointment online, but it's basically a coin toss, right? So
Yeah.
yeah. So the The data collection in the app, we actually run Snowplow. So it's been an interesting journey. We just implemented Snowplow at the end of last year. We've chosen a little bit of a spicy take, but we've chosen a somewhat generic concept in that we don't name our events explicitly. So the traditional approach with like Amplitude or Mixpanel, which we previously used Mixpanel, was to name events as they are doing in the app, like completing the app tour or things like that. But actually, we've just attached everything to the UX. So we've attached everything to behavioral UX interactions, like closing a list item or opening up a card or flipping a card. And we actually do all of the derivation of those actions in the data warehouse, in the data modeling stage.
Very cool. So we're really deviating from my prepared questions here, but I'm just kind of interested in going down this a little bit further. So what drove you away from Mixpanel into Snowplow?
Black box of logic. It's that simple.
Okay.
Prepackaged analytics tools, all of them have exactly the same issue, which is that at some point, if you reach data maturity or you have the data resources and skills and know-how in your organization, you will want to have more granular control, and you can't get it. It's just simply not possible. And them telling you, oh, you can export to the warehouse, it's like, well, then why am I paying you hundreds of dollars a month for your solution when I don't use your UI anymore? Like that doesn't make any sense for me. That's not a value proposition that makes sense.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So public service announcement for everyone watching. So to ask us a question, it's just if you're on LinkedIn, it's just comments on the page that you're currently on. Just leave a comment that'll show up for us. We'll take any question that comes in, and if you're on YouTube, it's just the chat. So chat us a comment or chat us a question or comment a question is what I was trying to say there. Looking forward to seeing some questions come in. So Maddie, I noticed you do have a course on decision science on Maven's website. So can you tell us, like, first, how did you get started learning in decision science, and then like what was your first hands-on project like? What was that path like? Can you give us a little background on that? And you can also tell us, you could
Yeah.
do a pitch for the course as well. Feel free.
Sure. Absolutely. So the Maven course is an interesting one. So it came about because of a problem. And the problem was that I had a lot of interactions with stakeholders over the past several years. And those interactions would go like this. And I'm sure a lot of you listening right now will identify with this. And you, Jeff, you probably identify with this as well. Someone will say, can we find out how many people came to our website from this campaign and then purchased this product? And you say, yes, we can find that out. Is it okay? How many people was it? And then you go down this line of questioning where they ask you for something, you deliver it, and then they run away and you never see them again. And you have no idea why they needed that information. You have no idea how that information is going to impact any decision making or the business, even if it will, right? And I got really tired of doing that because I wanted to know what these people were doing. So I started to fake it. People would come to me with a question and I would give them a number that was obviously false. And they would say, but you didn't look at the number. I said, yeah, I want to know what you're going to do with this. Imagine this was the number. What are you going to do with it now? And they were stumped. They actually didn't know. And I said, why are we going down this process of answering hundreds of questions if we don't know why we're asking them in the first place? And then I learned that this process of questioning the questions and all of that is part of this sort of decision science architecture or process. So I started thinking about how do I approach it? And over the past several years, I then developed this process that I just call it Prime Route, which is basically just following a kind of framework about challenging stakeholder questions and framing them properly, and then working through them and doing what I call analysis cycles, which are very short bursts of iterations where you find out the very important key information that you need to take a decision. But the decision is always in the focus, right? And eventually you arrive at a conclusion where you can say, this is the decision we're going to take. And then you draft a hypothesis and you experiment. That's how it should be, ideally. In a lot of organizations, sadly, it's not. And so I wanted to tell people about it. So I started talking about it. And then people wanted to know more and more and more. And I said, "Oh, I can't cover this in 45 minutes. Let me just make a course on it and see if anyone wants to come." And so I've run the course twice, and the feedback's been really, really positive.
Wow.
I haven't had like, hundreds of students or something like that. It's been very, very good with the two groups I've had. And I'll be running it again in the fall, and I'll continue to run it because it's a lot of fun.
Very cool. Are there other courses that you offer as well, or is that your primary course so far?
No, that's the course I offer. I think that's also kind of my focus at the moment. And I think that's where I can deliver the most amount of value. I think that's where most businesses stumble today as well, is they enable self-service in order to get people to answer these questions, but all that typically really does is allow people to ask more questions. And then you just spend your entire organization's resources answering more questions, which I don't
Yeah.
really think is desirable in a lot of cases.
Nice. So one of the things that's talked a lot about on LinkedIn is this idea of imposter syndrome, and that you need to be an absolute expert, or you need to feel like you're an absolute expert before you share knowledge, which I don't think is true at all. I think that to get over imposter syndrome, as soon as you learn something, just share it. You could be like, "Hey, look, I learned this cool thing. Did anyone else know this?" And you could just go ahead and share it. But how long did it take you before you felt expert enough, or before you grew your expertise enough to begin teaching others?
So I don't really feel like I'm an expert still. I
Oh,
know it sounds a bit silly, but I don't really see myself as an expert. I am on this kind of path of continuous learning. And because I learn by doing, I just want everybody else to also experience that. Because what I found is that if people are a part of that process is a lot better. Like the outcomes are much better. I get a lot of really good feedback. I get different perspectives offered. And like you said, I agree. Everybody has a perspective to offer. And I'm really interested in hearing those perspectives, which is why I do a lot of live streaming, right? Yeah.
absolutely. So Dan Golden, one of our biggest supporters on LinkedIn here, says good point around wanting to understand why people are asking for specific bits of information before pulling it. And for sure, it can be solved as a process, but are there certain products you've seen that nudge people to do this on their own?
Interesting.
So this is
I
like a
haven't thought.
self-service analytics question, I think. Is like, does
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
self-service exist? Is what I'm getting from this question.
I think what we as data people, and I don't know if Dan is a data person, but what we as data people typically find is that we are put into this very special bucket where somehow the organization thinks that everyone outside of data should also have data knowledge, but that doesn't happen in other parts of the business. Like no one in marketing expects someone to write copy for the website outside of marketing. No one in the tech team is expected to make designs. That's the job of the UX and design teams. But somehow we want people outside the data team to consume and use data as part of their work, even though they have no underlying understanding of how the data is collected, problems that we have, et cetera, around privacy, ethics, all this stuff. So I like the fact that there is a hurdle for the organization to ask the data team their question. And if you lower that barrier, if you lower that bar with self service tools, then it comes back to my original point, which is you're just getting people to ask very low tier questions about very descriptive stuff, what happened, and not why it happened or where else it's happening and how that could influence a decision. So I don't know a tool today that would allow you to keep that barrier high and like, you know, ensure a certain quality of questions. We personally use a Slack workflow. So we're still in the process of rolling out a lot of self-serve in Count. I do believe that there needs to be some level of self-serve, like operational boards, right? Like how many sales you have today, etc. Those
Yeah,
kinds of things, you need to have that information. But when it comes to like deeper questions around feature design and things like that, we have a Slack process where we ask people questions and they need to fill it out. And then we get a certain level of information and we can work with that a lot more than I'm interested in knowing how many users use bookmarks, right? Because that doesn't go anywhere, that question, right?
totally. It's interesting. So we've talked a lot on the show about self-service analytics tools, Alteryx, Tableau, obviously two very different use cases. Alteryx more on the transformation and data prep side, and Tableau on the visualization side. Both tools very much marketed to business users and not as much marketed to data engineers or data visualization experts in the case of Tableau. But you always see a much different result when you put the tool in the hands of a data engineer for Alteryx or a data visualization expert for Tableau than you do if you just give it to the average business person. And that's not to say that most of us didn't start as average business people and then grow a love for it. But I do think it's almost like a certain personality type of like someone who is curious enough to want to figure out how these tools work and really become good at them. So it's like a desire to like, and I'm just using Alteryx as an example. This could be absolutely any tool in the world, but I'll just keep going with Alteryx because it's very much marketed to business users, but very much really an engineering tool at its core. So I think it's like less than 5%, maybe even 1% of the people out there are going to really excel at using Alteryx, designing really great workflows that are production ready to drive the business, are not tangled webs. So it's an interesting dichotomy when we try and roll out a bunch of self-service analytics, you don't often get the result that you want. That was one point I wanted to make. And then also in response to what you were saying about having them ask the right questions, I wonder if there's an opportunity for AI to kind of help with this. So there's a few companies out there that are using a semantic layer to help inform AI and help AI answer the questions more accurately. But what if instead of just doing that and providing an accurate answer to the question that they asked, what if you can train the AI to help people ask better questions and make the AI
So
push
yeah,
back? Like, what are you going to do with that?
yeah.
Like,
I
why do you
think
want to
there's
know this? Like, I can answer this for
yeah,
you, but
I think there's a lot of potential in that, and I'm quite certain that there's a company or two working on that at the moment because they've identified. I don't believe I'm unique in the position of having identified poor questions as a really big point in the business to optimize. I don't think I'm the only person to see that. The problem I think that we have is that the interaction from human to human is a lot different than human to machine. So when someone approaches me with a question that's poorly formulated, I can massage that back to them because I have business context, I have knowledge of them as a person, and I can say, "Oh, you remember last time like we spoke about when when you use the word users, I don't know what you're talking about, so you have to be a little bit more clear and
yeah,
say, do you mean app user? Do you mean, registered user, and not, not just generic formulations?" Whereas an LLM will typically take the direct route or the generic route, which might not suit everyone, and then that might create a lot of feelings of tension between the system and then the person, and then the person just doesn't use the system anymore. And then that's where you get these kind of shadow data warehouses where marketing starts to build everything in Excel themselves because they don't want to use your tool because it's aggressive in its tonality. So I could see a risk in that as well.
totally. Hey Dan, thanks for the question. Let us know if you think that we answered it or if there's a follow up there. But yeah, I think there's tons of self-service tools out there, but a lot of the AI companies, the ones that are trying to do AI self-service, are raising a very good point that there's a lot of tools out there that call themselves self-service, but they're really not. Like, put your average sales rep, who's like, just like some old business dude, in front of a self-service BI tool and be like, "There's your data." Not so much, but I feel that most people, like 99% of people out there, are good at consuming dashboards. So your average sales rep could say, "Make me a dashboard that shows me how much I sold yesterday, how much I sold week to date, month to date, quarter to date, period to date. How does that compare to the same week, month, quarter last year?" And then we can make a dashboard, and they're going to consume it, and they're going to love it. And show me my top products, show me my top customers. They're going to be great at gleaning value from a dashboard, but it, there's very few tools out there that are targeted to the masses. That's like anyone could just log in and answer those questions themselves without having us curate it for them.
Yeah, I think that's the use case with the LLM, right? Is like bringing the interface closer to us in terms of linguistics, right? Rather than having someone need to point and click around and create a dashboard, which they can't. So then it goes to the data team. You then push that in the other direction where someone can talk to, a chatbot, right? And ask them the things that they want to know. The issue I always have with dashboards, and this is a very common phenomenon, is that if you do create dashboards for all of these types of lines of questions, you end up with 22,000 dashboards in your organization, because everybody thinks that they need a dashboard for something, and they say, oh, it would be nice to see this. And then there's no critical questioning of like, once you have this information, what are you going to do with it? How is it going to affect your day-to-day work? What decisions are you taking with it? And 90% of the time, people don't know that. They haven't thought about it. So they just end up creating dashboards, and all these assets kind of just lie around.
Yeah.
You know?
So one of the processes that I've seen work really well, specifically on Tableau Server or Tableau Cloud, is like a governance framework. Basically, is for your analysts, you give them their own little playground, their own little space where they can go create published dashboards. But your data team is going to own what we call certified content. So with Tableau, you have the idea of a data source, which is just like a table or something that you can connect to. And then you have the concept of a dashboard that uses a data source. And so we have certified data sources, which the analysts consume to make their playground content. And then we have certified dashboards, which are then consumed by whoever the decision makers are or the target audience for that dashboard. So that's one kind of framework that I've seen work pretty well to stop the proliferation of like 20,000 dashboards. Is like, well, certified content, we're going to manage the number of certified content. And if you need another piece of certified content, we could start asking why. We could start asking if there's another piece of certified content we should retire. Spoke in depth with Ethan Aaron about this a few weeks ago, because he's very famous for repeating on LinkedIn that an organization should only have 10 dashboards. He's very much into that number. And when I pressed him on it during the live stream, we kind of said, well, at least 10 data sets per person responsible for maintaining them. So if you have a data team for supply chain and a data team for sales and a data team for HR, maybe each one of those organizations might need 10 data sets, right? So, but anyway.
The thing is, it's hard to come up with like a hard number. I mean,
yeah, hard number is tough.
I know Ethan's pretty adamant about that number. I think in our case, so we do have these static assets like reports or dashboards that we produce. Over 80% of them are for external partners outside the organization, like investors and partners of the business that we work with in the medical field and health field. And they need that information because they don't have the insight into our day-to-day. They don't know what's happening. So I think those are exempt from that process. And internally, we have at the moment 2 reports or static dashboards, and everything else is, I wouldn't call them like ad hoc. They're just they're decision focused. We had around this bookmark question. So in every app you can kind of favorite something, and we have a lot of places in the app where you can favorite things. And the UX team is looking into doing a project of kind of unifying the favorites into its own feature. And we said, well, what's the basis for this? Where's the research to show that that's something that users want? Where's the problem that you're solving? And so they did some more research to, bring that. And then we surfaced some data on that. And now they've come up with a proposal. Now we actually have to evaluate whether that proposal is a good or a bad decision. And that's what we're doing. And then eventually we will archive that board. I mean, people could still access it later if they were interested, but it goes then into a kind of overall monitoring phase where we try and determine if that has a positive impact or not. And that's, I think every company has different processes. In our case, we call them product bets, where when they design a change or talk about a change in the app, they have to make a bet. And it's basically a hypothesis. And they have to make a bet, and then we track the bet. And then at some point, we don't need to track the bet anymore.
Because you knew it was either a good bet or a bad bet, and you could stop tracking it.
Exactly. And that's how you don't end up with 22,000 boards, in my opinion.
Let's see. Yeah. Nice. Let's see. Dan wrote back. Oh, by the way, did you notice that in the top right corner of your screen, you could kind of pre-read the comments as well? I'm just letting you know.
Yeah.
But okay, cool.
Hmm.
So Dan wrote back. Let's see what he said here. He liked the answer. Tools are only as good as the user, and best data folk I've worked with are ones that have been thinking more like product manager, trying to understand underlying problems better. I like the point around AI too, of being more about guidance versus providing answers. Then you're enabling people to do a better job on their own.
I
Cool.
like that word enabling. Um, the last one of the companies I used to work for, we had to create a name for our team, which was like two data people within the operations team, and I actually called us data enablement because because that was our whole purpose, was really enabling everybody else in the organization to do cool stuff with data. Like we were feeding data back into Salesforce. We were doing cool segmentation stuff, right? Obviously analytical things too, but that's what it came down to. So I like that word enablement a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of our job is enablement as data people. By the way, quick pitch for Dan, who's been participating here. He's doing a live stream at 2 p.m. right after this one wraps up. He's having like data office hours. I think it's going to be Zoom that's also streamed on LinkedIn, so people can, I think, request to join him on Zoom and go live with Dan, and he can help think through your questions. So look up Dan on LinkedIn, everyone who's watching. And if you're interested in another kind of ask us anything back to back here, let's do that. I'll certainly be joining in with Dan because he's been such a huge participant in the show here. So actually, I think this is a pretty good segue into my next question I had about what like leadership reaction to your decision science process. Now, and the reason why I think it's a good segue is because you were just talking about product bets, or like the story that you told about how they wanted to build a new favorites feature in the app, and you're kind of pushing back on people. Um, Maybe you could tie that into part of the answer. But yeah, so just generally speaking, what is the reaction from leadership been around your decision science process?
So the initial reaction was skepticism about whether the organization can move from a, in some ways, extrinsically motivated. We have a lot of partners who tell us a lot of things of what they want to see in the app, and then things end up on the roadmap kind of thing. Moving that to, or adopting this process for things that people didn't come up with on their own, right? Because we didn't implement a lot of ideas that came bottom up initially in the last couple of years. And that's changing a lot now. There's a lot more ideas. There's a lot more space in the roadmap for ideas that come out of the organization. So there was a little bit of skepticism about would people adopt this kind of thing for a project that they didn't fundamentally come up with on their own. But once we showed how people were responding to the idea of making these bets and formulating them and recognizing the importance of it, their attitude changed pretty much 180. And we've gotten an incredible amount of leadership support and management support in developing all this training material. We hold sessions with each of our squads, like each team that's producing different parts of the app. We've been holding education sessions with them, answering their questions, developing materials to help them draft better hypotheses without having to ask us every single time. Because at the beginning, they didn't know how to formulate a hypothesis, right? They didn't understand the difference between an independent and dependent variable, and how they have to formulate an assumption, and the difference between assumption and evidence, and like all these different things. And we've gotten so much support and resources from the management team to do those things, because they see that it works, because it's no longer just putting stuff into sprints and doing them, and then later someone asking, oh, that feature we released like 2 months ago, was it good? Or like what was the deal with that? And they don't even have a concrete measure or metric in mind of what to even say is good or bad. They're just like, how did it go? It's like asking someone, they just spent like 6 months in university, and asking them, yeah, like, how did it go? That you would expect to ask something more concrete, like, what was your GPA? Did you graduate? Things like that. They don't even have those questions.
Man, it must feel really great to go from skepticism to flat out support.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And seeing, I've only been at the company for a little over a year. I joined last January in 2023, and my focus last year was kind of technical, because we had a very mixed panel driven setup with not much else, and we needed a lot more information to answer questions that were coming to us from externally as well as internally, and we just didn't have the data or the resources or the systems in place to do that. So I spent a lot of time interviewing and understanding these problems, and you know uh drinking, how does, what's the expression,
Drinking the Kool-Aid?
yeah, drinking the Kool-Aid of the stuff that I'm talking about, which is understanding problems. Like, I actually went out and tried to understand problems by talking to everyone else in the business about their problems, and then I came up with our kind of data stack, which is a multi-phase project. The initial implementation of Snowplow BigQuery is just the beginning. Obviously, there's going to be other things there, and then now since the initial implementation of Snowplow is now finished, and we started spending a lot more time thinking about how to surface this data to the organization and how to really drive this product development with these bets. That's where the discussion has pivoted a lot to how we're using the data and how we plan to use it in the future. Like, what's our data strategy exactly? And yeah, that's been really exciting to see that, yeah, that we've gotten the support that we need.
Very cool. Matthew, what are your approaches on data modeling?
So there's all these basically white male authors who came up with concepts many years ago. And as someone who's self-taught, I specifically don't remember what those architectures are. All I know is basically I'm very outcome driven. So for example, in our case, where we have a lot of behavioral data, we've adopted a kind of activity schema-esque approach, where, I don't know if you've heard of activity schema, but essentially when you have a table of events, everything is timestamped. And
Yep.
what you do is, from that timestamps, some of those events are what we call actions, right? Because not everything you do in a product is important, right? Could just be, people moving around list items or navigating between tabs. Those might not be so important for you, but other things like, finishing the tour of the app, or activating a biometric lock, things like that. Those are what we call user actions. And so basically we write definitions for user actions, and we use those timestamps, and we basically tie that event ID back into everything else. So we pull those event properties from the original event, and we do that with it's a really lean architecture. Actually, it's not like thousands of tables where there's like one table for each property. It's really very condensed. We have basically an event instance table that has all the events in it, and then we have an actions table that has the reference to the event ID, and then the name of the action, and 2 or 3 other important pieces of information, like which system it came from. And we do the same from backend. So if we have backend tables from our Postgres database, and we have things that are happening asynchronously in the app, like you can connect to a doctor, or you can like create this connection where you can send your doctor documents effectively.
Okay.
And this connection is done asynchronously. You request it while you're in the app, but it could be accepted months later or days later, ideally days, right? And so that request that it's initially sent, we actually keep checking that event against the backend event to see when it gets accepted, and only then does it count as a user action. And we actually timestamp the original event against the acceptance. So we don't consider the point where the doctor accepted it as the user action. And so you can do that basically when everything is time seried. In these time series, you can make everything into these kind of user actions approach. And then effectively in reporting at the moment, we have 2 architectures. And this is still where we're exploring a little bit. For things that are non-aggregate metrics, so things like unique users, where as you shift the time period or the time window, you need to recalculate. We actually provide snapshots of those numbers on a daily basis because that's the lowest granularity of reporting that we offer is by day. So for every day, no matter which date range you select, it will select dynamically which snapshot it takes so that it has the correct computed number, so that it doesn't add all the daily values together, which would be wrong because it's a unique value. And for the aggregated metrics that are, things like just sums or counts, we basically go directly onto these raw event tables. And the reason we can do that is because the raw event tables are actually scheduled queries. So the scheduled queries in BigQuery, they dump that table once every 30 minutes or so. And because that table is static, there's almost no computational effort required to query it. It's very, very low effort.
Nice. So yeah, I really like what you said about being outcome driven in data modeling. I think sometimes a lot of data engineers out there get hung up on following a particular style or methodology when it's like, hey, sometimes you just need to build what works and just be creative and start from scratch and say, what's the business problem we're trying to solve and how are we going to solve it? And not really worry about like, oh, hey, we're going to do data vault here. We're going to do star schema, etc. Not that those are exclusively different, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm not too concerned with what I'm doing called something. I'm
Right.
very concerned with, what are the implications of my approach? Does it cost more money long term? Like that's one of the things we ask ourselves is, okay, we only need to provide data once a day, freshness. Why do we have scheduled queries running every 30 minutes? Maybe we're going to change that latency. Maybe we're going to bump it to like 4 hours or 6 hours, right? Because for these kind of ad hoc analysis that we do, we wanted to have like current data, but we're probably going to lower that latency a lot.
How are you scheduling these queries?
So BigQuery is native scheduler at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. And is that how
and
you're
that
doing
ties.
like all your transformations, like just scheduled queries in BigQuery?
Yeah. So right now that's the case, and it comes back to your earlier question about DBT. So we
Yeah.
do not use DBT, but we are most probably going to start using Dataform as we are chunked into Google's infrastructure and everything. It does make sense to look at Dataform. I mean, it is
I'm looking this up on
SQL
the
and
fly. I
JavaScript.
haven't come across it yet.
It's SQL and JavaScript. It's basically the same thing as DBT with some very minor exceptions. I think the big difference is that Dataform is free as part of Google Cloud Infrastructure. I mean, you will have costs associated with running it, but this isn't the same as running DBT Cloud. And it's not the same as running DBT open source and architecting it yourself. So yeah, it's kind of a good compromise for an organization like us that doesn't have dedicated data engineers, that doesn't have dedicated data architects. I think that's a good approach, but we're still looking into it. We haven't really established a decision on it yet.
Does it have like a visual DAG though, like DBT does?
Yeah, so there is a kind of visual processing diagram. I'm not sure what it's called actually in Dataform language, but there is like a visual diagram that they show these tests and the sequence of how things are executed and things like
Okay,
that.
cool.
And I think that's probably the point where we're going to move away from scheduled queries as well.
Because that's one of the things like that really drew me into DBT is that I've walked into so many environments that were already robust environments before I got there, and inevitably there's views on top of views on top of views on top of views, or they're the same thing but with tables where it's even less clear on how they became created. Um, and in the case of views where it's right in the SQL, there's a from clause, and even that could be nested. Um, if there's multiple layers, it's really hard to tell like how things are built. And even if like you knew it on Friday, you had it fresh in your head on Friday, you come back in on Monday and you're like, okay, that's the reporting, the final end reporting object. What was upstream? Like how did if you need to
Yeah.
troubleshoot a column or something, it's really hard to trace back. And after
Yeah.
using DBT for just a couple of weeks and just being able to click through that DAG and just like, oh, this this table comes from that one and that one comes from that one. And if I need to troubleshoot a column, I can even before they had column level lineage, you could trace anything back to the source so quickly and then figure out where your problems are. It was
Yeah.
pretty game changing for me as far as just
Yeah,
workflow and
the
simplifying.
first time I used DBT, I had the same kind of reaction as you. Like, oh, I can trace back how this object was created in the first place, and now I know where it comes from, kind of thing. I think our complexity is severely minimized compared to a lot of organizations. I mean, the longest path, I actually looked at this yesterday because our documentation is in Miro at the moment, which I know is crazy, but our longest path is 4 tables distance
Oh, wow.
from column level. So it's still very manageable. It's very, very manageable. And that was like the point where I was like, okay, there's not a huge urgency to change it yet, but we also don't want to go too far down the path of where we are right now, and then 3 4 months down the line be in a place where we're like, oh, now we want to change it, but it's kind of too late, you know. So we have it on our radar, definitely.
Yeah. Does BigQuery have any type of visual representation of scheduled queries? Like if you have a like so I'll describe Snowflake and then you could tell me if BigQuery has the same thing. So Snowflake has the concept of a task, which would be like a scheduled query. And you can chain dependencies that say this task comes after this one and this one comes after that one. And then they'll actually draw for you in their new UI. It's a fairly new feature, but they could draw for you a lineage or a dependency graph of all of your tasks. Does BigQuery offer anything like that at all, or is that kind of a differentiator for Snowflake?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. I think it's possible that they offer something maybe not as fleshed out as that. Because recently I discovered that, for example, in a scheduled query, you can refer to the last runtime dynamically. And I didn't know that, for example. So the way that we've set up our schedules right now is you have basically a giant list of all of your scheduled queries with the cadence that they run on. You can run queries on demand, so you can just let them sit there, and then when you want to run it, you click in the UI or you fire an API call, right? But ours are all scheduled at a particular cadence, and because of this dependency, what you've talked about, we actually schedule them in different increments. So some of our queries run on the hour, some run at 5 past, some run at 10 past. Now, that's assuming that those queries run through in those 5 minutes, which at the
Right.
moment is fine. We have runtimes of sub 1 minute for all the queries. But you're right, it would be great to have this dependency, and we just haven't looked into it yet. But I think there's probably a way to do it. I
I
think it's
think
quite
that
long-term.
data form is going to be a big step up for you guys then, because you'll be able to chain all your dependencies and you won't have to do that classic thing that we all do before we have an orchestrator, which is a little bit of buffer, just enough buffer for it to finish. And then
Yeah.
time-based scheduling can get a little bit messy. And then, of course, introduce risk as those time buffers change.
That's
And
right. And we kind of calculated it out. And basically I always work on I do risk assessments. And our risk assessment was, what is the worst possible situation for one of these scheduled queries running afterwards? Well, it's going to be 1 hour late. And because our
that's right.
lowest reporting interval is 1 day, we simply don't care right now. It simply doesn't
Interesting.
matter.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So we can tolerate that level of failure. We can even tolerate a half day outage at this point because it would be fine. Like the table remains there, it just doesn't get updated. So people would still be able to query the data. They'd still have all their, reports and boards working. It would just be on our end that we'd have to sort out the scheduling, right? But you're right that I think dependency base is much better.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we have pretty decent viewership on LinkedIn right now. So anyone out there, if you'd like to ask a question to myself or to Matthew, just leave a comment on LinkedIn and we'll be able to get to that question in the next 9 minutes. So I'll tee up another question here. Let's talk about documentation. How important do you think documentation is in our role?
I have a spicy take. um, If data is not used as part of anything that is revenue driving for the business, documentation is irrelevant. It's very simple. In most cases, the data function is a cost center. And this is something we're actively moving away from in our organization. I can't talk too much about it publicly, but we as a data team are actually going to be value producing. We are going to be revenue generating for the business. And that means that those things that are especially revenue generating, but our activities overall need to be like any other revenue generating department. We need to have fallback, like in case the data team gets sick or in case something happens, there needs to be documentation there about how those things work and how those processes are. If you're a data team today that does reporting about business activities and you have a load of ETL systems that deliver data into Salesforce, what happens if your team isn't there for 2 weeks? Can you actually prove that that would be a loss of revenue for your business? Or is it just an assumption on your part? And if you can prove it, then the documentation becomes really important. But if you're just talking about dashboards, I don't think documentation is very important. You have to do it so that your team can operate, but it's basically minimum best effort. What is absolutely needed to run your team? Because the day that you have someone who's missing, I don't know, employee has an accident, for example, someone's out sick for a couple months, nothing really happens from that. You just have a lot more work to kind of figure it out, but there's no real implication for it.
So let me ask a question, and I'll share my answer after you share yours. But to what extent do you actually look at documentation to figure out how stuff works versus just diving in and figuring out how stuff works?
So we use documentation quite tightly. And when I refer to documentation, I'm talking about something like a Confluence page where I can see there's a status and a comment, for example, about something. So we're like implementing new user actions all the time. And there's like a comment there about a user action that's like, oh, by the way, this one has a really weird definition because this and this table isn't ready yet from our backend system, right? If I wanted to discover that on my own, I could definitely discover it on my own. Like I could, follow the chain of things, but it's faster through documentation. It's faster to go into a spreadsheet, see what we wrote. I think it's like an 80-20 thing. I'll generally look documentation first, but then of course, if I need to complete the picture or it's not there, I'll just go look. Yeah.
Makes sense. So my take on documentation is, so when I am tasked with creating documentation, I try and be as thorough as possible. And that's for two reasons. One is, it's an opportunity to kind of show off the good work that you did. So if you can, if you did something that's really cool and then you could document it and just really show that flow, and then someone else can look at that and just be like, yeah, all right. Not only did he do a good job implementing it, he did a good job documenting it, and it makes sense. And that's a real tight approach. So that's one kind of reason. And another reason is because I've had multiple people in the past tell me hey, I found your documentation on XYZ and it actually helped me figure out how to do this thing or whatever. And so I could see that it's useful. But for my personality type, I almost never visit documentation to figure out how stuff works. So I do it because I have to do it because I know it's the right thing to do. But I almost never use it. And I think a lot of data engineers are like that.
It's kind of
What's
ironic. It's kind of ironic. I mean, you spend so much time creating thorough documentation that's really well written and that you can be proud of. But if someone else did that, the likelihood that you read that is pretty low.
Yeah, it is ironic for sure. Yeah, I haven't been at organizations that have excellent templates and policies for documentation, really, I don't know, just some really standard ways of doing things that are super helpful. It's almost like everyone has their own kind of implementation of it. Even if there's a template, what goes into that template might be different in varying levels of usefulness. So I think it's just been based on the experience. I've never worked on a large data team. I've also never worked on a classic dev team. So I think it's just the limited experience that I have with that. So
Yeah, I think we've also worked in very different organizations. I've exclusively worked in companies under 250 employees. So my experience has also been somewhat skewed by that. I've never worked in an organization with 30,000 people where if you don't write documentation, you probably get reprimanded for it. If that's like part of the standard operating procedure of the company, for example. Um, or you decide to use leading commas and your colleagues using trailing commas, and then there's like a whole feud on that. Um, so my experience has definitely been shaped a lot by being very lean and being extremely efficient as possible because we simply didn't have the resources to do anything else.
yeah. So the last few years, I've been using SQL Fluff to format my SQL, and it eliminates all conversations about opinions on how SQL should look, because you could set certain rules and then say it's just going to do what it's going to do, and no one is going to like all of the implementation, the indents, the where it does the line breaks. No one is going to be like, I love the SQL Fluff formatting. So it's like we all kind of like dislike the formatting a little bit, but it eliminates all discussion on how we should format our code. And I find that as a productivity booster. So you never have to have that leading trailing comma discussion again. And actually, one cool thing that I've done in a lot of places now is you could do a pre-commit hook on a DBT repository or whatever your repository is that you're maintaining your SQL code in, that says on commit, run the SQL Fluff, run SQL
Oh,
Fluff fix.
nice.
So it's physically impossible for them to commit something that hasn't been linted and fixed, which is pretty cool.
That's very cool. Yeah. We
I can I could share with you how to do that too, if you're interested. I could send you a repo that has it.
you should send that my way. That's pretty interesting. We have, I mean, the base of our SQL logic is basically in these scheduled queries, and for now we said as long as we are consistent within the query itself, as long as it's the same within one query, that's okay. Because we only have about 20-30 queries, so that's okay. And the rest of our queries are within these cells in count. So there it's a little bit up to
It's free
the person
form.
who's writing it. It's
Yeah.
a free form at that time, but as long as it's readable, I think it's still okay. We haven't reached that scale yet where I
Where it
can't
really matters. Yeah.
read the code. So yeah, I think we're both pretty conscious of that. But one of us writes leading and one of us writes trailing, so that always leads to some fun comments, let's say,
Are
in the
you a
code of
leader or a
like,
trailer?
I would love to know what you think, if I'm a leader or a trailer.
I think you're trailing commas.
I am a trailer. Yeah,
Yes. Just like the
I am a
English
trailer.
language, the commas go after the word.
Yeah, and that's been my argument. Is if you need to read the code, then you should use trailing commas. Now, my colleague said you need to use leading because leading is better for developing the code, and then you don't really spend a lot of time reading it later. But yeah, the opinions differ. I know there's been a lot of surveys over the years. I think at Big Data London last year, Count even ran like a one of their polls during the day where people could on a whiteboard they could mark themselves as leading versus trailing. And it ended up being really close apparently. So just like almost 50-50.
They
Yeah.
had that at Coalesce, the DBT conference this year.
What
Same
was the
thing, and
result of the
it was
survey?
very close actually.
Oh yeah, yeah. I do think that both are fine. You just have to
Yeah.
kind of align on which when and how you adhere to it. Yeah. But I like the SQL fluff thing. That's very cool.
So, if you don't, do you mind if we go like 2 minutes late? Because the last question I had prepared for you was kind of a selfish question that I would really want to know your answer to. So, do you mind if we keep going for about 2 or 3 more minutes?
We can go over 5 minutes, no problem. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So, you have a pretty successful YouTube channel and pretty successful Twitch channel as well. I'm just scratching the surface on content creation, so I'm wondering like what that journey was like for you. Any insights you can give me on how that's been?
I have a pretty unique take on this, I think. I don't create content for the purpose of creating content. I do it because they are things that I want to find out or things that I want to read about or things that I want to learn. And like I said a little bit earlier, I believe that doing it with and for others makes that learning process more effective for me, because I am a learn by doing person. And what I found out is that if I'm live streaming learning how to program a website, I get live feedback on why are you taking this approach? Have you thought about this approach? Or, oh, that's simply wrong and you've been stuck for 20 minutes, let me help you. Whereas doing that on your own, you can of course learn on your own, but it's slower. And so the approach that I've taken the last 3 years or so when creating content has been, I'm investing somewhere between 8 to 12 hours a week in my own development. And by creating content and by thinking about these topics and doing the research on these things, I'm making the best investment possible, which is in myself. And no company is prepared to pay you double, or 1.5 times your salary for investing those additional hours, by the way.
Right.
So that's something you have to want to do for yourself. And so my advice to anyone looking to create content or thinking about creating content is, you have to want to do it for you. If you are thinking about creating content for someone else, you will burn out. There is no question. I've seen it in the last 3 years. I've seen it happen to many, many creators from all different industries, from all different walks of life. It is almost a given that you will burn out eventually, because you have no internal drive, basically.
Makes a lot of sense. So is your typical live stream you coding and you solving problems on the fly, and people are
Yes.
joining and they're joining in, they're watching, commenting, helping, asking questions, that type of thing?
Disrupting. Yes.
Yeah, disrupting.
Exactly.
I
There's a very fine line between people helping and then people obviously being a little bit trolly and making things a little bit more entertaining by making it more difficult, right? Because that's also part of the fun, is that people can disrupt what's going on. And yeah, my typical live streams on Mondays are very much these kind of active learning days where doing programming or data analysis live and talking it through with everyone and just seeing where it goes. I usually have like dedicated goal or idea before I start the stream. So next Monday, for example, I will be setting up tracking for a website that I made for that purpose. I'm using Pivik Pro. It's a tool out of Poland. It's a web analytics tool, and it's a sponsored stream that we're doing together. And I'm basically going to show how to go from how to install it from scratch. And because I've never done it before, it's going to be quite interesting, I think, to see how it gets implemented. And then Fridays, so in about an hour from now, I host a show called The Data Cafe, and that's where we talk about different news articles. We talk about privacy and ethics. We talk about technological things. We talk about different companies that have released different products. I know that Avo, for example, released a huge thing on Product Hunt this or last week. So we basically talk through those things together and cover like the news and data.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I really wish that my day job, my work here as a consultant was more conducive to being able to live stream it. Obviously, everything I work on is confidential, so I can't do that. But I come across so many interesting challenges that I think would just be fun to share with someone else. And then I want to share that again on YouTube, then I have to recreate a fake example of the data, obfuscate the data, or just use, like cartoon data or whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really wish that just like I could just like turn on work and just start streaming and be like, hey, let's solve an interesting SQL problem. Let's solve an interesting Python problem. I think that actually would be pretty fun.
I would love to do the same. And I've talked about being able to do it for a long time. And then the reality of working in data is that it's usually not possible.
Yeah, it's confidential
So
always.
yeah, you can, of course, there is like a workaround, which is if you have a company that would be willing to do so, you could kind of get like a sampled data set. Like if you were doing something in SQL, for example, you could take like 5% of your data set, because then everything you derive is going to be 5% of whatever, it's going to be like a
Yeah.
subset, just to like see if your query works. But of course, the whole point of doing it is to kind of like deploy it in the real thing. So then you would have to take that really nice kind of finalizing part away from the audience, and I think that would be very unsatisfactory for a lot of people.
Well, cool, Maddie. You need a break before your stream tonight, so I'm going to let you go. But this has been really fun. I really enjoyed the conversation today. And for everyone on LinkedIn, thanks for tuning in. This is the season finale of the Ask Us Anything analytics. So I've done, I think, 6 of them so far. And I'm going to be taking a little break just so I can, just relax on Fridays. But thanks to everyone who's tuned in over the last few weeks. It's been super, super fun. And it looks like Maddie just put his Twitch thing in the chat. So there's going to be a comment right on the LinkedIn post. So you can join Maddie in an hour from now for his stream.
Yeah, I would love if people come over. We can talk about a lot of different data topics as well. LinkedIn's kind of like shadow banned me on live streams. I don't know exactly why that is. Probably because I complained about their top voice program a couple months back.
Interesting.
So I only appear as LinkedIn user. I don't know how to get it fixed, actually.
Yeah, it says LinkedIn user posted, and I was like, I guess that was him.
Yeah, probably should have said that beforehand.
No, it's all good.
Yeah.
Hey, well, once again, thanks for joining. This has been really fun.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I look forward to your chats in the future with other people. Absolutely.
Cool. All right, we are off the